Hi guys, today we're gonna do just an overview of the American Revolution. It's stuff you should have gone over in civics and in US, so I'll be brief, but hit on the main points that you need to keep in mind for this class. So we're gonna focus on ideology of the background. We'll start with Aristotle and his classifications of government. He wrote a book in the 6th century called The Republic that classified and defined different types of governments and attempted to explain in what situations they would be best. Now, Aristotle was very critical of what he called corrupt governments, tyrannical governments, oligarchical governments, and democracy, which he saw as easily corruptible through bribes. The legitimate governments he lists are monarchies, aristocracies, polities, governments that tend to be more historically stable, because they tend to be governed by people who have experience sharing power and governing. But, Aristotle's wrong about a lot of things, so I don't know how much credit we'll give him here, but I did want to start with his classifications. Our government has three basic concepts. It's ordered, it's limited, and it is representative. I'm kind of losing my voice, so I'm sorry if I sound weird. It's ordered in the sense that we have regulations within each branch and regulations on how those branches interact with each other. It's limited in the fact that the government doesn't have all power, and there are certain rights that individuals have that can't be infringed upon by the government, natural rights or unalienable rights. And then also our government is representative. It is supposed to serve the will of the people. Now this is your flipped classroom assignment. I'm going to upload excerpts from the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights to Google Classroom, so you can look through them if you'd like. I also have some information about it in the PowerPoint itself, so you can use that as well. But the documents are good to look at too, because they give you a broader view of the documents themselves. So you're going to create a Venn diagram and put it on your flipped assignment page. And for each category in the Venn diagram, you're going to list three concepts of similarities, three concepts of differences. And then you're going to answer the question here, why are we reading the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and U.S. government? In other words, how are they relevant to what we're doing in class? So to review Magna Carta, which I don't know if you've talked about in a class since world history, it is the first major document in Western history to limit the power of the monarchy. So it specifically limited the king's power to tax English citizens, and it gave citizens the right to due process and a trial, and attempted to set up common law. It allowed citizens to elect people to represent them, which eventually led to the creation of a parliament. Initially, it was just a gathering of the nobility, but expanded later on into two houses of parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and it promoted the idea of freedom of religion. Then there's the English Bill of Rights, which wasn't ratified until after the English Civil War, in which a couple of monarchs were executed and they had a dictator for a brief period of time, and there was a genocide in Ireland. It was a pretty crappy time. But the English Bill of Rights was adopted at the end of that pretty terrible time for England, and it limited the king's power again to tax English citizens. It gave citizens the right to due process in a trial, allowed citizens to elect people to represent them, provided citizens with opportunities to come to the king with complaints about the parliament and potential abuses there. It was signed in something called the Glorious Revolution with King William and Queen Mary in cooperation with the Parliament. And England has been a limited or a constitutional monarchy since 1689. In fact, our government, our country, is the only country in the age of revolutions to overthrow a government that was not an absolute monarchy. It actually was a limited monarchy. So moving on to colonial governments. Each American colony had a governor, a legislature, and a court system. In some instances, the governor was a royally appointed governor or a parliamentary appointed governor. Sometimes they were democratically elected, but that was less common. But the legislature was usually democratically elected, and the court system was, all of those positions were filled by colonists. There was democracy, but it was limited. Only white male property owners could vote, like in the old days of the United States. So the way it was in the colonial era is how it continued to be even after the Revolution. There were 3 parts to all of the colonial democracies. There were 13 of them because there are 13 colonies. All of them had their own written constitution. All of them elected their own representatives. And all of them defined separation of powers between branches in their colonies. So if they already have that system of government, why did they revolt? Well, from the beginning of colonialism in the 1600s up until the 1760s, Great Britain had largely left the colonists to self-rule. 2 events changed that, though. That was the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, and King George III's ascension to the throne in the 1760s. The French and Indian War, you'll remember from U.S. history, put the colonies in Great Britain into a lot of debt. But Great Britain did win, which meant that there was more land potentially for the colonists, even though there were some treaties made with natives to stop potential conflict between the colonists and the natives. So again, just to refresh, this war lasts from 1750 until 1763. It's the British versus the French, so it's the British and their colonists versus the French and the Indians. The British victory meant great British dominance over all of North America. So there's a big swath of land. All of this, all of the lined territories are what is taken by the British after the French and Indian War, and then of course all the red are the colonies that they had already claimed. So they have all this extra territory, and now the colonists don't need Great Britain to protect them from the French. But Great Britain wants to keep their troops there because there is concern about native retaliation. And because, there's some growing concern about the colonists themselves. King George III was fully in support of this war. Spent lots and lots of money on the war, as rulers in the 1700s did. It got expensive. It doubled the national debt. And King George expected the colonists to help pay off the debt. Now, prior to this, when the colonists enjoyed a period of self-rule, they really didn't pay that much in taxes. Most historians agree that they actually paid less in taxes than the average British citizen. But then all of a sudden, sorry about that, they're expected to pay a higher share. So they start taxing everything. You remember the Stamp Act. It's the first direct tax on colonists. It taxed all paper and also playing cards and dice, weirdly enough. Not sure why that was included, but it was. And it led to widespread protests, which then led to its repeal. Other direct taxes quickly took its place, though. The Townshend Acts taxed items not produced in North America that the colonists could only buy from Great Britain. Now this tax had a low tax rate, but it was still revenue producing. And a lot of the taxes, actually, I should mention, they weren't high taxes. A lot of the issue that actually the Americans had was that the British were actually cutting down on some of their smuggling and ways that they were trading with other countries and avoiding taxes from the British. So the other thing the Townshend Acts does is it permits search warrants for smuggled goods, which again is actually probably more of a concern to the Americans than the low tax rates. So lots of money is going to the British to help pay off that debt, but little is coming back to the colonies. They're not seeing return for their taxes. And the colonies begin to realize that other colonists and the other 13 colonies feel the same way, which leads to a growing sense of community, especially among the northern and mid-northern colonies. Americans begin to think of themselves as something different than the British. You guys remember this political cartoon from Ben Franklin? And then of course there's the Tea Party, not the Republican one, but the classical liberal one where they throw a bunch of tea into the harbor while dressed as Native Americans. This is one of the first major boycotts of the British. There's an even cooler version of the Tea Party, let me go back for just a second, that happened in Greensboro, North Carolina, in which a bunch of women made a giant tea bonfire, which seems a lot cooler but doesn't get a lot of press. Then there are the Intolerable, also known as the Coercive Acts. It was a response to the Boston Tea Party. Basically, the British wanted to make an example out of Massachusetts. They closed down the border. They enact martial law. They withdrew all of the self-governing rights of Massachusetts. They enact the Quartering Act, which allows British soldiers to occupy the private residencies of colonists and other buildings that they own. They have the Administration of Justice Act, where Great Britain officials would be tried in Great Britain, even for crimes committed in the colonies, so you could be extradited to Britain for boycotting or protesting or doing smuggling, which would take months, and, the conditions that they probably have you in to transport you back and forth as a prisoner aren't very good, so there's a high likelihood of dying. Then there's the First Continental Congress. This lasted through the 1760s and the 1770s. They responded to the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Intolerable Acts. So they get together to form the first official joint Congress. The key participants of this Congress are John Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and they send the Declaration of Rights to King George III, protesting British colonial policies and asking them to repeal the unfair policies if they're not going to give them representation in the Parliament. They urge everyone to boycott goods until the taxes are repealed. King George sees this as an act of aggression. All of the colonies agree to do this except Georgia, because, Georgia, they never agree to anything. They're not even there for the Constitutional Convention. They're just the worst. The flipped assignment is a picture that I'm going to show you all with a comment or a quote from, it's a quote from King George about the protests. So what's depicted in the picture, what does he mean by this quote, and what's coming next? So here's the picture, here's the quote. Feel free to pause here. I'm going to move on. All right, so let me know if you have any questions about the flipped assignment tomorrow, and I guess that's it. I'll see you all in class.